A federal judge released $5.8 million this week. Within hours, Trump's lawyers were in front of an appeals court trying to freeze it. By the end of that same night, they had their answer. But to understand why this fight even exists and why the real number to watch is 14 times bigger, we have to go back 7 years to a magazine excerpt that started all of it. June 2019. Writer Jean Carroll published an excerpt from her memoir. In it, she accused Donald Trump of assaulting her in a dressing room at a Manhattan department store back in the mid-1990s. Trump denied it immediately, telling a reporter at the White House something that would end up quoted in court for years afterward, that Carroll was not his type and that the incident simply never happened. 5 months later, in November 2019, Carroll sued him for defamation. Not for the alleged assault itself, the statute of limitations on that had long expired. She sued him for calling her a liar. That was the opening move in what would become one of the longest-running legal fights of Trump's post-presidency. Here's the part most people skip past because it isn't dramatic, it's just slow. And that slowness matters for understanding everything that happened this week. In 2020, the Justice Department tried to get itself substituted in as the defendant, arguing Trump had been speaking in his official capacity as president when he denied Carroll's claims. That single argument tied the case up for nearly 2 years, bouncing between federal appeals courts and even getting kicked to the D.C. Court of Appeals for guidance. Then, in 2022, New York passed the Adult Survivors Act, a 1-year window letting people sue over old sexual assault claims even after the normal deadline had passed. Carroll used it immediately, filing a second lawsuit for battery, plus a fresh defamation claim over comments Trump had made denying her story yet again, this time on his own social media platform. 2 lawsuits running in parallel, both about the same underlying accusation, both about to head to trial within months of each other. The first case went to trial in the spring of 2023. Trump didn't attend. The jury's verdict: Trump was liable for sexual abuse and for defamation. Notably, the jury did not find him liable for rape under New York's legal definition, a distinction that mattered enormously for what happened next. Damages: $5 million. The day after that verdict, Trump appeared at a previously scheduled CNN town hall and denied Carroll's account again, on camera. Carroll's team simply added those new comments to her existing defamation claim. Trump, in turn, countersued Carroll over a comment she made in an interview of her own. The judge overseeing the case eventually threw that countersuit out, calling it a technicality that ignored how ordinary people actually use language. The second lawsuit, the one over Trump's more recent denials, went to trial the following January. This time, Trump showed up. He attended much of the trial and even took the stand in his own defense, turning courthouse appearances into campaign stops as he moved between Manhattan and New Hampshire during primary season. The jury didn't need to redecide whether the underlying assault happened. The first verdict had already settled that question for legal purposes. This jury's only job was deciding how much Trump owed for his additional public statements. Their number: $83.3 million. The day before that verdict came down, Trump told the courtroom directly, "This is not America." The jury disagreed with him. $83.3 million said so. Trump's team appealed the $83.3 million verdict. A federal appeals court in Manhattan declined to throw it out. When the full court later declined to let all of its judges rehear that appeal, Circuit Judge Denny Chin wrote an opinion laying out, in detail, what years of public denial had actually done to Carroll, describing her as having been harassed and humiliated, and having feared for her physical safety as a direct result of Trump's repeated public statements. That's a sitting federal appellate judge, in a written opinion, connecting the dollar figure directly to real-world consequences, not just a defamation technicality, but documented harm. Which brings us to this year. Trump's team took their fight over the smaller, $5 million verdict all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking it to hear an appeal. The court declined. No majority opinion needed to explain a refusal, it simply chose not to take the case. And when the Supreme Court declines to hear something, the ruling below it stands as final. That refusal is what unlocked everything that happened this week. With the Supreme Court door closed, U.S. District Judge Lewis Kaplan, the same judge who oversaw the original 2023 trial, ordered the money, held in escrow since the verdict, finally released. Interest accrued over more than 3 years pushed the total from $5 million to roughly $5.8 million. Kaplan wasn't subtle about why he was ruling this way now. In his own words, Trump has been stalling this case for years. That's the presiding judge on the record, naming delay itself as the strategy. Here's where the timeline compresses fast. Trump's attorneys didn't take days to respond to Kaplan's order. They filed a notice of appeal within hours, asking the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for an emergency, temporary pause on the release. Their argument: the case wasn't technically final because they'd separately asked the Supreme Court to reconsider its own refusal to hear it. Reconsideration requests like that are rarely ever granted, but as long as one was technically pending, they argued, the money should stay frozen a little longer. The Second Circuit didn't take days either. By late that same Wednesday night, the court denied the request outright. Order to appeal to denial all inside one calendar day. Carroll's attorney, Roberta Kaplan, no relation to the judge, filed a response, making clear her client's patience had run out. Her filing put it plainly: this is the end of the line. Trump, for his part, didn't go quiet. He returned to his social media platform to denounce the entire case, framing it as politically motivated and vowing to keep fighting it through every available means, arguing the underlying defamation claim itself should never have been allowed to stand against a sitting or former president. Two sharply different framings of the same ruling. One side calling it long overdue justice, the other calling it political targeting. Both sides said so, on the record, within the same 24 hours. Here's the part a lot of coverage buried entirely. The $5.8 million everyone's talking about this week isn't even the larger of the two judgments against Trump in this saga. The $83.3 million verdict from January 2024, the one over his more recent public statements, is still working through appeal. The Supreme Court hasn't yet decided whether it will even hear that case. And Trump's team has suggested that if they eventually win there, it could undercut the legal basis for this smaller $5 million verdict too, since both cases are built on the same underlying facts. This week closed one chapter. The much bigger number, still 14 times larger, remains completely undecided. Strip away the dollar figures for a second and look at just the pacing of this week alone: a court order, an emergency appeal, and a denial, all inside one day. That's not spin. That's simply what happens when years of appeals, procedural fights, and reconsideration requests finally run out of runway. Courts can and do move fast once the underlying legal questions have already been settled through years of prior review. This week is a clean, verifiable example of exactly that. Two things worth actually watching from here. First, whether the Supreme Court ever agrees to reconsider its own refusal on the $5 million case. Unlikely, given how rarely that happens, but not formally closed yet. Second, and bigger, whether the Supreme Court agrees to hear the $83.3 million case at all. That decision is still pending, and whatever the court decides will effectively determine how this entire 7-year legal saga ends. 7 years. 2 juries. 2 verdicts. And as of this week, $5.8 million released, while a judgment 14 times larger still sits on the Supreme Court's desk, waiting. If you want the moment-by-moment update the day the court rules on that bigger case, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the biggest number in the story still hasn't been decided.